Well, let's take a look now at a new study on drone strikes. It raises many questions about the Obama administration's drone campaign. The report was released this week by the Center for Civilians in Conflict at Columbia University. It sheds light on how the secrecy surrounding drone strikes leaves the public in the dark about the real consequences of drone warfare. It suggests that while drone deaths are significantly understated, not even the U.S. government knows the true death toll. And beyond the figures, the report takes a comprehensive look at the drone campaign's impact on civilians in Pakistan, Yemen, and Somalia. To talk more about the findings and what it all means, one of the authors of the study, Noreen Shah, Associate Director of the Counterterrorism and Human Rights Project at Columbia Law School. Noreen, welcome. So this report looks at problems with the drone campaign that have virtually gone unnoticed. Can you talk about some of these findings?
Our main finding is that there's way too much that we don't know about drone strikes. The U.S. government has ushered in a program of drone strikes. It started under President George W. Bush. It's vastly accelerated under President Obama. And it's in Yemen, it's in Somalia, it's in Pakistan, and we're even hearing reports that it's in Mali and the Philippines, all over the world, yet we don't know really who's involved in these drone strikes, what the standards are, and what the processes are.
Now, do you think that government officials and policymakers underestimate or fail to recognize some of the consequences of this drone campaign?
That's absolutely right. We're talking not just about the number of civilians killed or the number of militants killed, but the toll on these communities in parts of Pakistan, Somalia, and Yemen. We're talking about regions where there's already a problem of war, but this is really adding to the problem as we have civilians who are really caught in the crossfire between militant groups on the one hand and U.S. drone strikes on the other. They're afraid of being targeted merely because they're associating with individuals, because they're outside. They don't know what will let them be targeted, and that's creating for them an environment of hysteria and psychological torment when they just don't know when a drone will strike.
All right, and going along with that, can you talk more about that? Because I know that this report takes a really close look at that, not just at the death tolls of these strikes, but, you know, and that's oftentimes what we hear reported, what the media does focus on. But beyond that, how these drone strikes impact civilians on the ground.
Well, the impact is a great one, but it's also one that's gone unexplored even by journalists and organizations like ourselves, because we're talking about regions that are really restricted. That aside, what we're hearing and what our report references is the fact that there's civilians on the ground who are afraid to send their kids to school. They're afraid to seek medical attention because of these ongoing drone strikes, sometimes in Pakistan, very frequent drone strikes over a period of 2 or 3 weeks. People are afraid even to go out to associate with each other because they just don't know what will happen. We've heard stories about families being torn apart and really having a struggle for livelihood because a breadwinner is killed.
And what are the long-term effects of this? And in the end, is this fueling anti-American sentiment, which would then be counterproductive in terms of our foreign policy interests?
You know, it's so hard to tell because we're talking about places in the world where there's already some amount of anti-American sentiment. But what we do know is that whenever the U.S. is going into a country and exerting its force, they're going to polarize public debate in those countries. So U.S. anti-U.S. sentiment, that's the beginning of the iceberg, the tip of the iceberg, really, because we're also talking about governments in those countries that are seen as cooperating with the United States. They might lose their legitimacy in their own public's views. That can have a destabilizing effect on democracies and governments all across the world where we're conducting drone strikes.
And I want to talk about why people advocate drones. Proponents of drones and the U.S. government, they say, and they tout this precision that is enabled by drones. And it's presumed that such precision is able to pinpoint its targets and limit civilian deaths. Does this report say otherwise?
Well, the problem is that we're talking about a technology that's far beyond the practice. So we do have great technology. Drone technology is incredibly advanced, but in practice, if we're using it secretly and with few boots on the ground, we're not really realizing its advantages in terms of really being able to know who we're killing. In fact, we don't know who we're killing if we don't have ground troops on the ground to pinpoint the intelligence and to say, this is what's happened after the fact. We went and investigated and looked, and this is who we killed. So when you use drone technology without having boots on the ground, when you use it secretly, those advantages that we've heard the Obama administration reference aren't necessarily realized.
So you're talking about this covert drone campaign. That's essentially what it is. So when it comes to civilian protections, how does the use of drones compare to full-scale military operations, military operations that are more commonly known and commonly used that is, and where we've dealt with that as a nation before?
Well, there's a huge imbalance between the way a victim of a drone strike, a mistaken victim, would be treated in Afghanistan compared to Pakistan. In Afghanistan, they might get some recognition from the U.S. military. A person from the U.S. military might come and visit their family home and apologize for what has happened. They might be provided some compensation. It might not be enough. It can never be enough when a family member is killed. But in Pakistan, there's no one to go to when you think that you've been unjustly injured or when your family member has been killed. There's no visible sign of what's going on for these people except for the destruction of their home or the killing of their loved one. And that lack of visibility, that secrecy, can really damage U.S. credibility that we've so hard worked on so much in Afghanistan.
Now, what kind of precedent do you think that this is setting, this drone campaign? I mean, in terms of handling civilian protections and, the future use of drones, is this going to lead to drone warfare becoming the norm?
I do think that it's leading to drone warfare becoming the norm. And unfortunately, the United States is taking the lead in using this technology without taking the lead in setting its limits. Other countries are rapidly acquiring drone technology. Many already have it. We know that they'll be using it in future conflicts. And when we, the United States government, want to say you can't use drone technology in that way, we won't have a leg to stand on. The U.S. government will be called out as hypocrites because the United States never articulated those standards and those limits on its own practice.
So do you think that we're kind of setting the standard, setting the norm, and then, other countries are going to want to level the playing field, and what we have is, just all-out drone warfare? I mean, that sounds like a pretty scary scenario, but is this a future that we're looking at?
We are looking at that future, and unfortunately, it's history repeating itself, with the U.S. being the first country to use the atomic bomb, and every country after that saying, when the U.S. wanted to limit nuclear weapons, saying, well, you're the first ones who did it. And the bigger problem, drone technology, drone warfare, it is a scary thing. It's not just science fiction that we have the capability with drone technology of having autonomous robots. I know it sounds crazy, autonomous robots making those targeting decisions themselves. Now, I don't think the U.S. government would let that happen with our own drone technology, but we don't know how drone technology would be used by other countries. And that capability of autonomous robots is there.
And this absolutely sounds terrifying. And but despite what you're saying, drone strikes are widely supported in the United States. If there wasn't, actually, I want to bring some statistics regarding this. The number of Americans who agree with drone strikes, 83% approve of drone use against terrorist suspects overseas. 59% of supporters strongly agree. 26% of supporters somewhat agree. 79% of supporters think targeted killings of suspected American terrorists is justified. But Noreen, I want to ask you, if there wasn't as much secrecy surrounding drone strikes, and the civilian consequences, if they were made more public, do you think that there would be as much public support of this campaign?
I do think part of the problem is secrecy, but part of the problem is also that when people hear about drone strikes, they think of the U.S. surgically going after top terrorists, and that's it. What we actually have is not just a kill list with some top terrorists that we can go after and then get out. We have the U.S. going and conducting drone strikes against unidentified individuals, people traveling in convoys, people in groups walking around, schools, other buildings. That's the reports that we're hearing. It's not clear if that's the case, but we do know that the U.S. doesn't just go after these top terrorist leaders, and that's the common public perception, that it's just limited to a few bad guys. Now, that sounds good to anybody who's sick and tired of us being in Iraq and Afghanistan and wants to see U.S. troops come home and an end to these bloody conflicts, but the fact is that our drone war is expanding into a full war in that sense.
All right. Noreen, really appreciate you coming on the show. That was Noreen Shaw, Associate Director of the Counterterrorism and Human Rights Project at Columbia Law School.